this computer. All right, we recorded, and I figured out that I'm trying to figure out that if I teach next semester that we're going to be able to do the PowerPoint. I think what I'll do is I may have to bring another monitor, but off to the side that like you're seeing me, then off to your side you'd have the PowerPoint. When I changed it, it would change. But I don't know what I'm going to teach next quarter, and so if I teach next quarter, so I might be in Panama. I can't hear you. You muted on me, Jim.
I'll take you to Panama with me. I already told Linda.
I know she wanted to know how long I was going to stay down there, and that really got her when you says 2 hours a week.
2 hours a week.
Okay. All right. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll begin. Father, again, we're thankful to Thee for the day, for the blessings of life. We're thankful, Father, for Thy watch care over us, and we pray for the church throughout the world. We'll all strive, Father, to do those things that are to build up the church, that we edify and build it up, and we'll be able to preach the gospel to the lost and help those that are in need. We're mindful, Father, of all of those who are sick. We realize that every congregation has a list of people that are sick, and also others who have lists that the people who have passed away. We pray, Father, that watch care over all of those. We pray, Father, for our country. We ask Thy blessings to be with them as the lawmakers make laws. And we pray, Father, they'll do those things that are in accordance with Thy will. We pray for peace throughout the world. We thank Thee for Jesus who loved us and died for us. And we thank that we have His Word that we can study it and make application of those things to our life. Give us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're going to be studying about Syria, church at Antioch. And I can't remember, but I don't think this is in your book, so you'll get I'll send you my notes. It's from another book that has something similar to do with manners and customs, but what he does this different. It's like in the biblical archaeology studies, a lot of them just goes through and talks about, we'll say like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they keep coming, bringing it up, and so as you go through different places, it bring it up, and then but in this book, he actually looks at the different things, the roads, the government, the food, the clothing, and everything in reference to different cities or countries. Like this, the first one is going to be Syria. And the reason why we choose Syria, if you have your New Testament, you can turn to Acts chapter 11 when Paul goes up to Antioch there. And so when he goes up to Antioch, we find that he the church there becomes the center for that of his work. And so that's the reason why he starts there. And so we'll look and try to put all together some of the things that we've learned in reference to the customs and the manners of the New Testament world. Because we have to look, and this is a problem sometimes. We have to look at how they did things in the New Testament times. I think I brought up the discussion in reference to when did Jesus die, and I've always believed that He died on Friday. He was resurrected on Sunday, but that's not a literal 3 days and 3 nights. And so people have discussions on that from Wednesday to Thursday to Friday and so on. Some even go back to Tuesday, is what I was told. And so, but the point is, it's not a salvation issue, but it is something that you can talk about and try to discuss. But you have to make sure you remember how the Jewish people kept time, or counted time. In other words, if right now it is 6:35, so if this is Jewish time, even though we know this is Thursday, and that Thursday is the 5th day of the week, then the 6th day of the week is already started. Okay, because say Friday would be the 5th day of the week. It's already started. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the 5th day, and so we have to make sure we understand that way of timing. And so that's what we'll do in reference to we look at the church. In Acts chapter 11 and verse 26, it says there to us, and when he had found him, that is Barnabas was looking for Saul, when he had found him, he brought him unto Antioch. This is for Antioch of Syria. There's also another Antioch, says, and it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves together with the church and taught much people, and the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And so And then also over in Acts chapter 13 and in verse 2, Luke writes for us, he says, so they ministered in the Lord and fasted. The Holy Ghost said, separate me and Saul for the work whereunto I have called them. And so their work was to be, they were there at Antioch, but yet there was other works for them to do, so they were going to have to leave Antioch and go elsewhere and preach the gospel. Now, here in our day and time, that is now, and we see that we have gone through a lot of things in reference to Syria, because we have been taught and we have seen that one of the most dangerous training centers for Islamic terrorists is in Syria. So it's kind of hard to imagine that Syria was once called the cradle for the Church of Christ, that is the Lord's church. But yet at Antioch, that's the capital of Syria, the believers were called first by the name that they are known at the present time, that is Christians. And so as that the Christian community grew, we would find that the church would send out these missionaries, and Paul and Barnabas would be some that will go out. And Paul and Barnabas was commissioned from Antioch. Paul launched actually 3 missionary journeys to Cyprus, to Asia Minor, and also to Europe. And so the Christians was a coined word. Actually, if we were to get into discussion about that, it is a prophesied word. Isaiah 62 and Isaiah 65 basically points out to us that when the Gentiles are brought in, become a part of the kingdom of God, that a new name would be given, and that new name was going to be the name Christian. And so, because the Gentiles were brought in chapter 11 of the book of Acts, because we find the preaching of that of Cornelius, and so they obeyed the gospel. And so we have to ask what they had in mind when they used the term. Obviously, they saw believers as followers of Christ, or as the partisans of Christ. Now, when we think about that, and again, some of these writers of these books that we read and study, they use different terminology, and I try to change it as I talk or read from them. But we can discover any deeper meaning from the parallel Greek term or the concept, and the answer to be that would be yes. When we stop and think about those people who were slaves or soldiers of Caesar, they were called Caesarianos. And the comparable Greek word for Christianos implies a slave or soldier belonging to Christ. And so the idea is they had words for every one of them. And the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 19 and 20, made the very point that we are not our own, because we have been bought with a price, and that price was the blood of Jesus Christ. And so we find that he also spoke in Romans 1 and verse 1, and Philippians 1 and verse 1, and Titus 1 and verse 1, that really right at the very beginning, the Apostle Paul lets the people know when he writes to them that he is speaking as a bond slave of that of Christ. And also in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 12, he called on us to fight the good fight of faith. And as we do so, we have to put on the whole armor of God, Ephesians 6 and verse 11. So the point being is to us is that we are that of Christians. And so they were called Christians first at Antioch. They were supposed to defend the faith. Now, we've looked reference to Rome. In other words, the world of the New Testament is the Roman world. And also we saw within the Roman world the laws and the customs and the manners of that of the Jewish people too. Now, when we stop and think about Syria, the boundaries of Syria had shifted over the centuries, and it's actually depended upon the political arrangement in the area. When we stop and think about before the New Testament opened, the Roman general, we talked about Pompey and how that he conquered the Seleucid kingdom in 64 BC and made it the province of Syria. Actually, the Seleucids had once managed a control of most of the old Persian Empire, to the very extent sway to that of the Indus River, but gradually they lost their grip on that vast territory. And so again, in the rise of that of the Roman Caesars and the rise of Rome, when Pompey took over, they controlled only a fairly small kingdom at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So we have noticed up to this time, like it's prophesied by that of Daniel, that the kingdoms would come, and that kingdom would come, that when Christ would come, will be that of the Roman kingdom. And so we would find that during the boundaries of the province of Syria extended to the Mediterranean, south of Tyre, inland to a point east of Damascus, and so then north in an arc along the edge of the desert to the border of Cilicia. Now, the northern boundary laid at the bend of the Mediterranean. And so Antioch was on the Orontes River. And if we were talking about geography, we would talk about those. And it was the great capital. And Damascus was the venerable old city. And Damascus is really the oldest city. And it was due east of that of Sidon. And so the province of Syria included much of what is now Syria plus Lebanon, that is ancient Phoenicia, and a small chunk of that is southern Turkey. Now, again, when we look at the physical features of Syria, they consist of some strongly marked zones like west to east and coastal plain and the mountain range, the valleys, the vegetation that's there, the stony or the sandy tracts in the east, which are either desert or largely unproductive. And even today, we see some of that while they're on TV. And I don't know about you, but when I watch them and they show our military and some of the others, they show things. I kind of watch the terrain and so on. But the Mediterranean coast of Syria is quite straight, and there's with no deep gulf or protecting the island of any size. And so, but Laodicea, ancient Laodicea, has had a small harbor during the New Testament times. Now, notice I said it was small. And it wasn't one of the big ports like we would stop and think about that of Rome. But Cilicia, the port of Antioch, was hardly more than a road state. And so the coastal plain, never more than a few miles wide, was largely inconsequential in reference to the Syrian history. We don't read much about that. And there wasn't the trade that they had at other ports. But much of it remains merely a broad strip of sand dunes covered by short grass and low bushes today. And so overlooking that coastal plain is a line of mountains that begins with the Amanus Mountains in the north and exceeds all the way to the towering mass of Sinai in that of the south. And now the Amanus River, my understanding is that it rises to a height of something like 5,000 on the mountains, 5,000 feet. That'd be a deep river if it's 5,000 feet. But the mountains are southward offshoot of the Taurus system. So it separates that of Syria from Asia Minor. And the Amanus is cut on its southern fringe by the Orontes gorge and is crossed by the roads to the Antioch and to Aleppo. The chief pass, as you look at that of the mountains, we have is the mountains is at Bailan, the Syrian gate, at an altitude of something like 2,400 feet. 2,400 feet. And some of the Orontes range continues evenly as it's broken by the Kibble River, which today forms the border between Syria and Lebanon. And so to the south of the Kibble, that extends for about 105 miles, the Lebanon mountains, with peaks up to 10,000 feet. So when we look at the physical features of this western mountain range, behind that is this deep valley, a great fault extended from the Armenian to the Gulf of Aqaba. And so the eastern arm of the Red Sea. And so we've studied about that from the Old Testament and containing the deepest ditch on the earth's surface. So we may start along this third topographical region of Syria in the neighborhood of Antioch, where the Orontes River turns westward to cut through the mountains to the sea. And so here is the plain. It's broad and extremely rich. None of it's more than 600 feet above sea level. And so then you go through that of the valley of the Orontes and ascend slowly between the western ranges, a range in the high plateau of that of north Syria. Now at Hamath, the altitude is 1,015 feet, and at Emesa, it rises to 1,660 feet. So when we look at these places, that is the Homs, as it's called, ancient Emesa, valley there, the cleft between the Lebanon and the anti-Liban mountains. And so you have this varying breadth from 6 to 10 miles, and then there's a rise at about 3,770 feet. So here, when you look at all the mountainous area, here is the watershed. To the north flows the Orontes, and that's 246 miles long and largely unnavigable. In other words, you can get on it and so forth. But to the south flows the Litanian, that's 90 miles long, and both rivers eventually turn westward and flow into the Mediterranean Sea. So that's their watershed. Now, El Baca is something like 75 miles long and has always been a rich agricultural pastoral region. Okay, it's grazing land supported those large flocks of sheep and goats, and its vines and other fruits flourish, and there's good wheat land. It is good wheat land, and here as well as along the lower course of the Orontes, there are abundant ruins of ancient towns, and terrifying to the fact that the whole area was prosperous in ancient times, much more so than the present. So things have changed there. The eastern mountain range, the anti-Liban, constitutes that fourth topographical region of Syria, but he has no counterpart to the northmost section of the western mountain range. And so rising from that of the Syrian plateau south of the Homs, it opposes the Lebanon's in almost equal length and height. And so this mountain complex now is in two parts by the broad plateau and the gorge of the Marietta. Now, the Marietta, as we stop in the Marietta River is what it's called. If you recall the story of 2 Kings 5 of Naaman, that he talks about the rivers, instead of him being going dipping 7 times in the River Jordan, and some people kind of suggest, the River Jordan may have been at flood stage at that time, or we have to remember that the Jordan is actually, it's a muddy looking place. And up in Cartersville, we have the Etowah River. When the rain is raining, it has rained, and you go out and you look, it is muddy looking, dirty. Well, that's the way that the Jordan River would be, but the Abana River, now called the Marietta, would be clear. So to the north is the Jebel Esh Serka, that is the eastern mountain, the uttermost ledge of which is the high plateau, some 20 miles broad and about 7,500 feet high. It has a stony desert resting on the foundation of kalky limestone. So its western flank falls steeply to El Baca, and it's virtually uninhabitable. And the eastern side is more actually acceptable. Now, the southern range of that, as we said earlier, in reference to the eastern mountain, or Mount Hermon, it rises about 9,232 feet and is one of the highest and most majestic peaks of Syria. And so here, snow settles deep in the winter and hardly disappears from the summit to in summertime even. And in contrast to all of that, the northern part of the anti-Liban's Mount Hermon has more villages on the western slopes and fewer on the eastern. Then you have Damascus. As we look at Damascus, it's a commercial hub, and we have to remember that it was the Apostle Paul that was on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, 22 and 26 also. And so we look upon that of Damascus that describes several caravan routes over which people would move to all different areas of the ancient Near East. And so from Marietta and on to the middle of Euphrates came a route over which traveled products from the eastern Mediterranean Valley to the west. Goods from all over the Mediterranean world landed at the port of Beirut, Tyre, Sidon, and Acco. So especially from Acco, they came across northern Galilee to Damascus. Now, from this North Galilee road, and we talked about the roads at that time, merchants also could journey south through the plain of Esdraelon along the coastal route road to that of Egypt. Or one could take another branch of that road through the hills of Samaria to Jerusalem or the Jordan Valley. So here's this road complex, and we've talked about that earlier a few weeks ago about their roads. And so here's the way that the roads would go through that of Syria. And it was possible to go from Damascus through the highlands of east of the Jordan, on the King's Highway, to the Gulf of Aqaba and also Arabia. And so on the south and the east, the slopes of Mount Hermon fell swiftly in the vast plateau of Haran. And so there was this treeless surface, of which is volcanic, and its soil is a rich red loam. And so this lava would covers an area almost 60 miles long by as much as many wide. And on the east side of that is bounded by the mountains of Haran, or the mountains of the Druids. This bulwark is about 35 miles north and south, 20 east and west, with a summit that rises about 6,000 feet. So kind of mountainous area. But in the north of Haran is 2,000 and 3,000 feet above sea level, but on the south it shelves off to a limit to deep in the valley of the Yarmouk. So here in the New Testament times, as the Arantius, and in the Old Testament times as Bashan, the Haran has some of the best wheat land in that of the Near East. So during the Roman period, it served as one of the granaries of the empire. So Syria was the country Syria and the towns around it that made it up were very valuable to that of the economy of that of the Roman government. And plus, they had to have the roads that they had, and they had to have the port, even though it wasn't a big port. They had to have all of those things in order to move their goods and to also to receive goods. Now you have the anti-Laban, Lebanon mountains that collect their water and then send it southward into the Jordan system and eastward far into the desert. Damascus is about 30 miles east of Mount Hermon. So in that channel of the Marietta River, that is a Banner River, 2 Kings chapter 5, that's what it's called in the Old Testament during the days of Naaman, created about 150 square miles of fertility, the Guta, from which rises the city of Damascus and civilization outpost in the desert. And so, though defenseless and on no natural line of commerce, Damascus has learned to exploit the fertility of her hitherland and to bend to herself much of the traffic between Egypt and Mesopotamia, as well as points west. So in this way, she retained her prosperity over the centuries. And even today, and I looked this up today, it has a population of 1,711,000 people. So it's a pretty good sized area. But again, the Barada or the Abada River, 45 miles long approximately, divided into 5 branches in Damascus. In that oasis, and again, finally loses itself in the desert. And another river which rises in the anti-Libyans is the biblical Pharpar, and that's again that other place that Naaman brings up. It's identified as Awa, which flows some distance of Damascus, south of Damascus, and disappears in the swamps east of the city. Here again was where Naaman was immensely proud of both of these life-giving rivers of his homeland. And with us having that kind of knowledge, then we can understand that even though that Naaman is an Old Testament character, how important it was in reference to the places that he was to, they asked him to go and dip 7 times, and how that he was very proud of those 2 rivers. So he has to go down to the Jordan River, the old muddy Jordan River, and like I said, it was muddy. But east of Haran, that's Hauran plateau, and its boundary of Jebel Edruz, lies the Syrian desert, now, which is really, it's a continuation of the Arabian desert. And the only pictures that I've ever had in my mind is of the Arabian deserts. I think came from watching movies on TV, the Arabian Nights and so forth. And so this Syro-Iraqi desert forms a huge triangle whose base rests on the Gulf of Aqaba, on the west, the Gulf of Kuwait on the east, and whose apex reaches toward Aleppo on the north at its widest. This desert actually stretches 800 miles. Now you look at all of that and knowing that how fertile and how prosperous they can be, the climate of Syria has changed since New Testament times. And Syrians of Jesus' day cultivated areas now that are just desert, east of home, so where there is now not a green leaf nor a drop of water. And we learned from the archaeologists that they have found the heavy basalt slabs of former oil presses in large quantities. And as pointed out in our studies, new research demonstrates that the whole Mediterranean basin was cooler and wetter in the height of the Roman Empire. And so the Syrian summer is hot and long. It's from May to September. It's winter being short and mild, but there is considerable regional variation. Rainfall on the western mountain slopes and in the north of Syria is adequate, but the eastern slopes have less precipitation. And so while Latakia on the coast enjoys over 30 inches of rainfall per year, the average Damascus is about 9 inches, and at Aleppo approximately 18 inches. And so rainfall, is something that they need. But yet again, they have the rivers, and so they do some of their watering from that. Then you look at the government of that Syria. You recall that we talked about Pompey. When Pompey converted the kingdom of Syria to the province of Syria around 64 BC. He was working with a land that had fallen into virtual chaos under the Seleucid kings. Now, among the land, you had the Arab chiefs, the Nabateans, the Jews, the pirate chiefs, and you had others, and all of them had established their independence in some various nooks or crannies of the land. So here is Pompey, who's converting the kingdom of Syria into a province. So at first he allows, and remember that as we talk about customs and manners, that all of those had different customs and manners, but yet they seemed as if they kind of got along with one another. At first, Pompey allowed these several principalities or political entities to subsist on the outskirts of the province or within its general framework. Arab dynasties paid annual tribute. The Nabatean king kept Damascus for a lump sum of money. And even the Jews, Judea, was a subject state within the province. So he granted Greek cities internal freedom, and so he formed 10 of them in a league known as the Capitals. So this provincial government ruled from the capital at Antioch, but because that this was a frontier province that faced the powerful Parthian kingdom, Rome placed Syria under the rule of a proconsul with the power to raise troops and to wage war. And so there was one by the name of Galbanus. Pompey's legate was in charge from 57 to 55 BC. He comes along and he builds a number of cities, or rebuilds them, that was destroyed back up by the Maccabees, such as Samaria and Gaza. And Galbanus was succeeded by Crassus, an associate of Pompey and Julius Caesar in the first triumvirate, whatever they call it. They triumvirate. He died in a battle with the Parthians around 53 BC. Now, the subsequent civil war in Rome involved the forces of Pompey and also Julius Caesar, and then Augustus Caesar, Octavian, and Mark Antony, and that threw Syria once again into confusion. Now, again, we have to stop and think all this will take place before it becomes, as we would say, the center of the missionary work of the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas. But Octavian, he had a victory in 31 BC that brought welcome relief to the Syrians who longed for a restoration of stable government. And so here was Herod the Great, who controlled Jerusalem in 37 BC and the kingship of the Jews. And he had some success with Antiochus Epiphanes and had failed in making Judea an imitation of the Hellenistic kingdom. That means allowed the Greek culture to take over. His great new city of Caesarea became the capital of the Roman Judea. So other constructions were noted. And so actually Judea was associated with Syria at times, and at others was under one or more native rulers. And so after Titus's destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Judah became a separate imperial province under the legate with a legion stationed at Caesarea. And so a certain cultural cohesiveness developed in Syria with the onward march of the Hellenism. Greek was the lingua franca, that is, the Greeks were strong in the artistic and philosophical fields. Though Rome permitted the native communities a great deal of local autonomy. And so basically they were taking over these places and they were becoming part of the Roman kingdom, but they were allowing them actually to do some of the things that they'd always done, I guess in what we would say to keep them satisfied or keep them happy, so that they would be a part of that of the Roman government. They would be able to submit or would submit. So what they really wanted, they wanted ethnic and cultural similarity and unity. So all the Syrians became Semitized, that is, speaking Aramaic at home and on the informal level, and Greek in business and other dealings. And so again, remember now that the Greek became, Koine Greek became the language of the common person. And so they use Latin for official communication. So here it is that we find that in John 19 and verse 20, that the inscription over the head of Jesus, over Jesus' head on the cross, was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. That is the Aramaic vernacular. Now, the reason why, again, going back, all the Syrians, they spoke Aramaic at home. They spoke Greek in business and other dealings, and they used Latin for official communication. And so the Phoenicians were even more Hellenized than their neighbors in the province. In the first century, lost their old Canaanite speech. So Rome worked as urbanization, as the Seleucids had, and eventually organized almost the entire province into urban units. So here the Romans assumed responsibility for Syria's defense. Now that was a great help to them with Italian troops, and they financed it by tribute from the local population. In other words, they taxed them. So under the Roman emperor, Syria was a place of imperial power. They stationed 4 legions there to protect the frontier. Now you can imagine again, because we described the area, the mountainous areas, the rivers, and so forth that are there. But a province directly under the supervision of the emperor, it had large legates as governors whose terms of office lasted 3 to 5 years, and the legate was responsible for security of Roman holdings throughout the Western Asia. They established security from just about everyone, and so we find that general prosperity and security led to an increase in population. And so, which by the beginning of the 2nd century, we would have found that there were 7 million, according to one estimate. And so that was their government. And then we find the religion, because we look at all of that, and now we're going to look in reference to the rise of Christianity. So we've looked at all of that and see the background of that of Syria, and now they are going to become, as we would say, the area where Paul's going to do his missionary work. Now, the writer of the book that I got this from, he talks about, he's kind of like Brother Jack Lewis is in biblical archaeology. This fellow talks about, he says the first time that he went to Antioch was around 1960. And he says it betrayed it little of greatness it had known when it was the cradle of Christianity in the 1st century. The city was hard to get to. Well, that's what Brother Lewis said about a lot of places over there. And he said we negotiated with a driver in his car to Adana to take us through the pass known as the Syrian Gates into Turkish Antaka, the ancient Assyrian Antioch. The city of some 50,000, now about 125,000, was economically depressed. The hotel with its 28 rooms was just adequate, but the manager was friendly and helpful. He went on to talk about how that he found and walked at the Cadius, the main street where Paul and Barnabas were there, walked across the Roman bridge over the Orontos River. The excellent museum had a wonderful displays of the mosaics taken from the houses of the Roman period and so forth. And he says we could see firsthand some of the elegance and the fluence of the early Antioch. The memory of the Christian church had been preserved as well in what they called the St. Peter's Church. And it's basically, that was a cave where Christians supposedly met, and they put in the front of which the Crusaders erected a facade. And so as the third most important city of the Roman Empire in the first century now, and with a population commonly put at 500,000, Antioch stood only behind Rome and Alexandria and Egypt. So now you think about that. A crossroads of the world, it had business connections in all parts of the Roman Empire. And because, again, you remember the road system that's there, and also the cosmopolitan nature of its population contributed to the success of the gospel. And Paul then preached the gospel there, and many people obeyed the gospel according to Acts chapter 11. So a large Jewish community helped greatly with the development of Christianity in Antioch. Metzger estimated that they comprised about 1/7 of the population that is Christians. And so these people lived in three separate settlements, one on the west of the city of Daphe, and a second on the city in the plain, and the third in the city proper. So as everyone else, the Jewish faith attracted Gentiles who followed in Judaism an ethical doctrine superior to what they knew in pagan teaching. So all this was set up, and so we would find that here comes that of Christianity. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Acts chapter 11. I have to turn my Bible right side so I can read it. In Acts chapter 11, the Bible helps us in reference to that of Antioch. We find that he says in Acts chapter 11, and just read verses, let me look down through 19 through 29. Then we'll come back. He begins there, and he says, now they which were scattered abroad. Now remember, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, the church saw persecution, therefore they were scattered abroad. Now, this is very important because he brings that back up. It's been Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Now he brings it back up now. They which were scattered abroad, that is the members of the church, upon the persecution that arose about Stephen, traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, preaching the word to none but unto the Jews only. Now get that, unto the Jews only. Now, again, Peter had already gone to Cornelius and preached the gospel to the Gentiles. They haven't had the council yet in Acts chapter 15, which will come up because of what's taking place from Antioch. And he says, and the hand of the Lord, go back, and verse 20, and some of them were men in Cyprus and Cyrene, which when they were come to Antioch spake unto the Grecians, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned unto the Lord. Then tidings of these things came into the ears of the church, which was in Jerusalem, and they sent forth with Barnabas that he should go as far as Antioch, who, when he came and had seen the grace of God, was glad and exhorted them all that with purpose of heart they should cleave unto the Lord, for he was a good man. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Ghost and faith, and much people was added unto the Lord. And so then departed Barnabas to Tarsus to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch, and it came to pass that the whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. The disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. And in those days came prophets from Jerusalem. Now here he comes unto Antioch, and there stood up one named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there would be a great dearth throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. You look on the Acts timeline and find that time. It says, then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which dwelt in Judea. Isn't that amazing? This Gentile city now was going to help the Jewish brethren that was Christians in Judea, which also they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So when this persecution had broken out in that of Jerusalem, many of the followers, Jewish followers, obeyed the gospel there up to Acts chapter 8, fled, and they came to Antioch, and there they were preaching to the Jews. But some began to preach the Greek-speaking pagans as well. Now, parenthetically, it is interesting to see that the Gentiles from Antioch, Nicholas became one of the 7 first deacons, as we call them, though they're really not called that, they're servants, in Jerusalem, Acts 6 and verse 5. But he was from Antioch, and evidently most of the early converts in Antioch came from the Gentile community. So in that large cosmopolitan city, traditional barriers of race and religion meant less than in Palestine and elsewhere, and the church grew rapidly. Now again, let's stop and think. Remember, we've brought up the dispersion and things of that sort, that what happened is that the Jews were dispersed before New Testament times, and therefore those Jewish people in those areas had accepted some of the Greek culture and things of that sort. And they actually seemed to get along with that of the Gentile people. So we can understand that, yes, God did have a plan. And so since they were dispersed and they had this plan and Jewish people were there, you had a mixture of that of Jewish and Gentile people, with them accepting one another's culture or some things about them. And so when the gospel came, there were those people, when a Gentile preached, Jewish people listened and obeyed the gospel. When the Jewish people, Christians preached, Gentile people would listen and obey the gospel. So when the reports of the success of the gospel of Antioch reached Jerusalem, 300 miles to the south now, the elders sent Barnabas from Cyprus to check out what was going on there, Acts 11:22, with a wider exposure to the Gentile world himself. So Barnabas felt at home there, and as he sought to find leadership for the new movement, he thought of Paul, that is Saul of Tarsus, who might help him in that venture, Acts 11, verse 25. So he brought Saul to the city, and they worked together for a whole year to advance the cause of the gospel in that city. They worked together. Now, the movement, that is the preaching and teaching the gospel, grew rapidly, and people of some means were converted to that of the faith. And the church contributed funds for the relief of that of the poor saints, even in that of Jerusalem, Acts 11, verse 29. And also later, if you turn over to Acts 13, and let me see here, verse 3, it says, in reference to that, it says, and when they had fasted and prayed, this is Paul and Barnabas and talking with the people there, says, laid hands on them and they sent them their way. That is simply the missionaries of Paul and Barnabas and others were being sent out to preach and teach the gospel into other areas. So Paul launched these 3 missionary journeys from Antioch. And we noted that before, that the believers were first called Christians there in that of Antioch. It is believed that Roman authorities in the city coined the term to have an official designation for the new sect, already becoming distinct from that of Judaism. But as I said earlier, that really is not the case. If you were to, let me look at my study Bible here. If we'll go over to Isaiah, chapter 62. That's Jeremiah. Isaiah 62. Here's what the Bible says. In Isaiah chapter 62, down in verse 12. Says, and they shall call them the holy people, the redeemed of the Lord, and thou shalt be called, sought out, a city not forsaken. Now look at 65 and verse 15 of Isaiah. Isaiah there says, and ye shall leave your name for a curse unto my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee and call his servants by another name. And so that would be when the Gentiles came in, therefore they would receive a new name, and that new name was the name Christian, according to that of prophecy. And so it wasn't, as some people try to say, that is a derogatory name that was given to them. As when they were making fun of them, they were followers of Christ. They were slaves, bond slaves, servants to that of the Christ. So as Christianity grew in Antioch among the Gentiles in Cyprus and Asia Minor, then here's this great question that came up. And that great question that came up was basically dealing with that, whether the Gentiles had to keep the law, that is the law of Moses. And so the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 determined that it was not necessary for them to do so. And so especially important was that they would not have to submit to circumcision, which to a convert probably would mean that he became a member of the Jewish race and gave up his Greco-Roman heritage. So having said all of this, we need to discover what Antioch was like when the gospel invaded it. Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, writes this on page 546. He says the Greek word proselytos in the Septuagint and Philo are the German of the, or Jerem of the Old Testament. Resistant aliens, friendly or allied with Jews, but not converts to Israel. This may be its meaning in the book of Acts, but in Matthew 23:15, it means a full convert to Judaism. Technical sense of the Jerem acquired in the rabbinic literature. The Septuagint also spoke of fears of the Lord, Psalm 115, verse 9 to 11. And Luke in Acts may have adapted this phrase to give a description of the Gentile sympathizers with the Jews. And he goes on and says there are much interest in proselytes around the beginning of that of Christianity. Several features of Judaism appealed to many of the Gentiles: the pure monotheism, the high ethical standard, the philosophical, rational, and non-sacrificial worship of the synagogue, and the ancient and inspired written revelation, and the social cohesiveness of that of the Jewish community. There is evidence of a considerable number of the Gentiles drawn to Judaism, either at full proselytes or with a lesser degree of attachment to the Jewish community, called God-fearers, to become a proselyte meant to join the Jewish community. So you had, as we said, the proselytes, and you had the God-fearers. And so they try to make some type of distinction in reference to them, reference to those people. And he says there is a difference between the proselyte and the missionary activity. The principal source cited for the latter is from the New Testament itself. It is easy for Christians to interpret that verse, Matthew 23, verse 15, of a vigorous missionary enterprise associated with Paul, but by no means limited to him. The practice in Judaism was different. A representative story is that of a young king of Abydos, recorded by Josephus. The royal family was attracted to the Jewish way of life through the teaching of a merchant. The requirements imposed on them were minimum, not even including circumcision. And this strict Jewish appeared on the scene, insisted on more complete compliance with the law, but they themselves did not undertake to make converts. And so this situation is kind of reflected in Matthew 23, verse 15. Strict Jews went out from Judea endeavoring to maintain a higher standard of conformity to that of the law. In other words, you had those people who were proselytes, and we know they were there. Acts 2 and verse 10, they were there on the day of Pentecost. So they had this kind of a problem. They had this higher standard, some of them did, that these people had to be circumcised. Well, when people obeyed the gospel, that same thing came up again. That these people, the Gentile people, had to be circumcised in order to be a part of the Jewish community, even though there is no distinction between a Jew and a Gentile anymore. So they did have these types of problems in reference to that. He goes on and talks about, Brother Ferguson does, circumcision and the proselyte baptism and how that was done and so on. And talks also about the offering they did at the temple. But let me look at, again, there's two other pages, and I wrote these down, I think, for a reason. Let me look as if I marked anything right quickly. No. Okay. So that would lead us then in reference to that of the fully developed city of Antioch. As we want to look at Antioch during the New Testament period, that was on the Orontes River as a walled enclave nestled between the river and this 15-foot high mountain. The city enjoyed major structures bestowed on it by a succession of Roman emperors and others. Even Julius Caesar had shown the way by building a theater, an amphitheater, an aqueduct, a public bath. Claudius reorganized the great games began by Augustus and named them Olympic Games to include theatric, drama, and musical events, as well as athletic contests and races in the hippodrome. So we would have the city then of that of Antioch. So Seleucus, the first, founded the city of Antioch in May of 300 BC, and it was in the valley of the Orontes River, 16 miles from the Mediterranean. So it's not very far again, by horseback or by mule, they could travel that in one day. So that was a pretty good way to bring in goods. And he laid out the city on a grid plan with streets intersection at right angles. And city planners also sought to make the best use of the sun in both summer and winter and to take advantage of the sea breeze that blew up the Orontes Valley. So to the original quarter of Seleucus, later added a second quarter with its own separate walls. And then the Seleucus II comes along, and also Antiochus III. And they built a third quarter on the island of in the Orontes with its palace and circus or hyperdome with an arena of 1,600 feet long. That was pretty big. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, added a fourth and final quarter. So then, they did all of that. Well, here comes Herod the Great, and he paves the main street with marble. And you can go online, and I'm trying to make sure I'm right. You can go online and look up Antioch, and they have a picture of the marble street. And so it was over 2 miles long. It measured 31 feet wide. They built roof colonnades 32 feet wide along each side of the street. And at each intersection, he erected vaulted stone roofs supported the houses on 4 columns and 3,200 columns. Many of them were pink and gray granite and composed the colonnade, and bronze decorations were attached to many of them. And so though the columns, one could enter public buildings and shops and villas. Thus, one could walk through the entire length of the city, northwest to southwest, undercover, possibly the world's first enclosed shopping mall. Now, we think that's something new, but that wasn't anything new. They had the very same thing. It's all up under one roof. So it's not necessary to list all the benefactors of Antioch and tell what they built. It is enough to say that the walls enclosing the city measured close to 10 miles. So a great amphitheater stood inside the southwest gate of that city. Among the midway along the main street sprawled the forum, and just above that on the slope of the mountain, Sippas stood the theater. And on the crown of Sippas toward the citadel for the city's defense. The great circus, Hippodrome, stood in the northwest of the city. The great temples to various gods function here and there. And so from the southwest gate to the road ascended on the Daffy, 5 miles away to the southwest. The walk was, as they would say, a beautiful walk, but a constant succession of orchards and gardens and filled with roses and other flowers scented the air. And gardeners grew the roses to make the perfume for which Antioch was very famous for. Beautiful country houses and villas stood among these gardens, and one could pause at inns along the way where in the shade of the vine-covered arbors a visitor could sip wine or fruit juices cooled in the underground cellar. So when you look at them, basically, they did not have all the conveniences that we had, but basically they had just about everything that we had. That is, in reference to things that are a need for that of a human being. Now, the pleasure of the garden was famous for its laurel trees of Daffy, the old cypresses, flowing and gushing water, its shiny temple of Apollo, and its magnificent festivals of the 10th of August. At the center of the Daffy stood an agora with bath and temples and spacious houses lined the streets, and which were laid out on a regular grid plan at the south edge of the suburb. Gushed over ever-flowing springs, and so the temple of Apollo, built by Seleucus Nictator, stood on the foot of the spring, and nearby lay the Olympic Stadium, and so Daphne was dedicated to Apollo, and Antioch was to Zeus. And so we would have the tragedies of Antioch, that is, it had its part of woes, since they were located in a earthquake-prone area, so it suffered in AD 37. There was a great earthquake, and Caligula provided help in rebuilding it, Caesar Caligula. And another earthquake occurred during Claudius' reign, and that was 41 to 54. An even more severe one came in 115 when the Emperor Trajan happened to be in the city, and he was injured in the disaster, but the worst earthquake struck in 526 AD. leveled almost the entire city and reported killing 250,000 people. So hardly had the survivors been able to catch their breath when an earthquake in 528 killed another 5,000. So although the Emperor Justinian helped rebuild the city within a few years after Antioch suffered a military disaster. And so in 540, we find that the Sasanian king, Khosroes, captured the city, burned it, carried off a large percentage of its inhabitants to Mesopotamia. And though Justinian soon recaptured it, and he went back and rebuilt everything, the new Antioch, it was much smaller and never regained its ancient glory as we have described it. The Kiki of Antioch, early in the history of Antioch, Seleucus Nicator erected the famous statue of Tiki, goddess of the good fortune, cast by Eutychus. Let me get this right. Eutychus. No, Eutychus of Sikon, a symbol of prosperity and good luck. The bronze goddess was draped in a large robe and was seated on the rock representing Mount Sipas. On her head, she wore a crown representing the walls of the city, and beneath her feet, a figure of a nude youth led in a swimming position, symbolizing the Orontes. In her right hand, she held a sheaf of wheat, signifying the material prosperity of the city. So, in a westerly direction from Antioch, a road led to the port of Seleucia, which could also be reached by boat in the New Testament times, since the Orontes was able to be navigated up into the center of that of Antioch, though the port flowed local products and goods afar. Cilicia especially offered an outlet on the Mediterranean to the Silk route that came from the heart of Asia through Iran and the Fertile Crescent by the way of the Persian Gulf and the Euphrates. So we see the very importance of that. Okay, it's 7:30, 7:28, so we'll come back and talk some more about that of Antioch and some of the things that are taking place. Okay, take a break. How? I was trying to remember who took it for credit.
You teach at two campuses?
No,
In 2018?
no, the only place I've taught is here,
Uh-huh.
Buford, and
That's more than one campus.
I said, you cannot minimize something. Okay. X. Mark Taylor.
But this is this
Yeah.
2018 or 17 or winter?
Mm-hmm.
That started in 17, ends in 18 or something.
Yeah, Mark Taylor is the only person I had. And he didn't do the test, even though he said he was going to do online credit. So he didn't, get a grade. You want copies of those?
Yeah, hold on, let me get my phone.
Okay.
So, okay, so what is this you're giving me? This is from
This is Acts.
this is the book of.
Yeah, and it was 2018
Mhm.
because here it is in July. So when I open it up, it's going to change that. So it's July the 7th, 2018 was the syllabus. Let's see what that is.
It's July
Yeah,
2018.
it'll tell me here what December is from December 2017 to March 9th, 2018. So let me do this idea.
And this is, I can write it down. I mean,
Yeah, but let me do it like this right here. We can solve about a problem. Where is that thing at now?
This is, you say the book of Acts?
Wait just a minute. Let's see here. Yeah. See, I can go right down here, go right here, do right there. Paste that right there, and you got the date and everything on. Okay, so you want that one.
Is this multiple students? Because that's when you said you only had one student.
I only had one for credit, but like I said, he didn't
hadn't finished.
finish it.
He was not completed.
Right. Okay.
And that was at which campus?
Here.
Here, okay.
Here. Book of Archaeology. Ezekiel, that was at Buford.
Buford gave me some grades. I probably got you on there.
Yeah, I sent it to them.
That's Ezekiel.
And I had Fisher's Man didn't have anybody.
Now the Buford one, was that a full course or a short course?
Full course.
And what was the title of that?
Ezekiel.
Oh, Ezekiel, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was in 2018. Is that the same time frame is this?
What, Ezekiel?
Yeah, we had in the July, well, okay, July, well, I've got December 2017 to 3/9/18 was a course in Marietta, and that was the Book of Acts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and then I had spring of 2008, the Godhead. I put it down there for all the names are on it with the grades.
Spring of 2018.
Yeah, the Godhead.
Godhead. And where was what campus was that?
Here.
Yeah, okay.
The only ones I've had is Ezekiel at Buford and biblical archaeology, which I'm doing now at Fayetteville. All of mine's been here.
That's the current one you're in now, the biblical archaeology, right?
Right.
That's it. Fayetteville in here.
Mm-hmm. And then I had Introduction to the New Testament.
Yeah, that's one I had.
I had it twice, 2017 and 2018.
So you got that to put on it too?
Yeah, Mm-hmm.
Oh, all that's on there.
Yeah, I'm going right down to what I've taught.
Oh, great.
Put them all in there.
Super.
I had, let's see here.
He's got the stuff on a backup drive that he had,
Mm-hmm.
but he's kind of afraid if he opens it up, that virus is in the backup drive and it's going to get back on his computer.
Hmm.
And then it'd all be lost. So I'm kind of backing up the backup here.
I said, I don't have the grades on that. Why don't I have the grades on that?
Maybe we were all auditing. I know when I had you, I was auditing. And my guys that I bring, you know.
Well, I gave tests to Stacy Walker. Stacy Walker is the one that finished it. I'm just going to put his test there,
Mm-hmm.
Stacy Walker, because that's something I have.
Okay. Was that 17 or 18?
18, 2018.
What's his name? Stacy Walker?
Stacy Walker, yeah. Psalms, do that, didn't do that, I didn't do that. Okay. Let me go down to here and see if I have. Okay. There it is. He talked to God here. There was a symbol. Why didn't I? Oh. Okay.
I'd like to see that Godhead class you had.
It was interesting. The first time I had notes on it, but that's all the ones that I had.
Okay.
Unless they come up with something that I didn't keep it. I try to keep everything. And I'll go back and look on Stacy and so forth. Sorry, y'all. Everybody back?
Thank you, Bobby.
Yes, sir. Just let me know if, it might be some grades somewhere else too. I can look at you, but if you find my name associated with some, I'll look again. But I think I got him on. Stacy Walker is the only one. If I'm not mistaken, he's the only one that finished that. He made an A. DMBA A.
Mm-hmm.
That was between 90 and 100. We could ask him because I think I may have a copy of his grade somewhere. I'd have to look it up. All right.
Sure.
Okay. Jumping Jim does left us, it looks like. Okay, had to take care of some administrative things there about tests and about students who got a grade.
When Jim comes back, I'm going to tease him because he was eating all in the beginning, and all I could hear was him eating his chips.
He's eating chips.
He was eating something that was noisy, and I'm like, I was going to give him a hard time.
I didn't hear him because he had me muted. He didn't have you muted?
Well, he didn't have he didn't have himself muted, so I could hear him over because it kind of, you know how it switches back and forth, whoever's talking.
He,
And so
he
it kept
thought time.
him. And when he comes back,
Okay, do I?
you can harass him for me.
Okay, if I see him come back.
All right.
Okay, then we would have, when we think about Antioch, Assyria, then we have that old paganism, that is a polytheistic era of, that preceded that of Christianity. And so paganism and the pagan institutions, you know, when Christianity went there, just did not lie down and play dead because Christianity was rising. Great temples to the ancient gods of Syria and the Greco-Roman deities thrived all over the land. And again, if you were studying the biblical archaeology thing, you look at those things up. Most of them come from the Old Testament, and so we do have some types of pictures of them or some stone statues or something of that sort. So, for example, Tiberius Caesar, who reigned 14 to 37, he during that time restored, rebuilt, and built the great temples to Jupiter, Capitolinus, Dionysus, and Pan in the capital of Antioch during the days of Jesus' earthly ministry. And so, and knowing that, you know, in my mind, we don't see Jesus, I guess, attacking the temples of those gods, but we do see him showing that there's only one God. And it makes me think about the Apostle Paul too, you know, about the unknown God. He says, I want to tell you about the unknown God. That is, he wants to tell me about God because they had a altar or a statue or something other for every God known under man on the earth at that time. But we find that sometimes we need to realize we can just teach what Jesus says, and it does the work that needs to be done. Someone will come back, you mean to tell me that it's wrong for me to worship something besides God? You know, like that. But also, the temple of Apollo was going strong in the sacred groves of Daphne near Antioch during the time that Paul launched the apostolic missionary ventures from the capital. There were great days of Baal. We talked about Baal, and were to come only during the latter part of the 2nd century. The great temples began to take shape during the first Christian century. There was Baalbek there, Helopolis. Modern Christians are probably more impressed with the greatness of Baalbek than first century Christians would have been, for the magnificent complex of temples there was not completed until sometimes during the 3rd century. But some of those things were started. The power of the pagan religions, pagan religion exerts great spiritual power. And this is true first because of the satanic energy or strength, as we would say. Those who minister in animistic communities often speak of the spiritual forces that seem to pervade the air when a witch doctor works the crowd. And my son had a friend, and he told me that his mother was a witch. I said, well, best thing for you to do is stay away from her. And so, but she was into the herbal business and vitamin business and stuff like that. But anyway, I don't think she was really a witch. But even in the most sophisticated Western society, we need to remember that the prince of the power of air, the spirit who now works in the son of disobedience, Ephesians 2 and verse 2, everywhere seeks to hold unbelievers in his grip. And we should also always remember that Satan is never going to give up. So Satan is energizing. When we think about what the Greek is, it's chilling. Greek is Satan is energizing. The English word is works in unbelievers and seems to keep them from faith in Christ. That's the idea of that Greek word there when he says the prince of power of the air, the spirit who now works. And so second, there is a ceremonial social aspect. Religion persisted as a community affair. The whole community periodically swept along its members in great public demonstrations. For example, during the annual Panathenaic procession in Athens, the whole citizenry wound its way through the Agora to the Acropolis to bring the new robe to Athenia. And great public demonstrations at Ephesus, a month-long Artemisian, a march in April included athletic, dramatic, and musical contests. The world that now participates in and celebrates the Olympics so enthusiastically or so intensely needs to remember that they used to be held in honor of Zeus. And also dramas began with sacrifice to the god of Dionysus. And so in short, almost all the public life was wrapped up in the worship of the pagan deities. And so anyone who became a Christian bucked the social current and came to be classified as antisocial, actually opposed to or harmful to the existing social order. That's what they looked upon. So Baalbek is located in a suburb 6 site about 51 miles east of Beirut at an altitude of 3,850 feet above the sea level, and on the caravan route linking that of Damascus and Damascus and Tyre. It has a fertile hinterland as well as commercial advantages. And so it's a beautiful site, and it's nested, they say, between Lebanon and the anti-Laban ranges. And so Baalbek means the town of Baal, and it seems to have been a Phoenician origin because it was considered to be the birthplace of the worship of the sun or of Baal. The site was held in special veneration. So the Seleucids called the city Heliopolis, the city of the sun. And the Romans identified the Baal of this city with Jupiter and called it Jupiter Heliopotamus. I haven't get this right. Heliopotamus. When the Romans took over, Augustus planted a Roman colony there. So probably as early as the reign of Augustus, this massive temple complex there was begun. Inscriptions show that the work on the temple of Jupiter was well underway during Nero's reign. And construction on the temple of Bacchus apparently began in the middle of the 1st century AD. So for 3 centuries, construction went on to the site that produced a magnificent complex exhibiting a sense of power and size and glorious magnificence. Now, you have to remember that if we were to stop for a moment and say, well, we see all this taking place here, and so you remember that in Acts chapter 19, we're going to talk about Ephesus too in some of the times that we have left in our next 3 weeks. And but you think about Ephesus, they had an uproar there because of what was taking place when people obeyed the gospel. They got rid of all of their charms and all of their little idols and all of their magical books and things of that sort. So it caused a big problem. So you can imagine what's going to go on here in reference to all this stuff, all this paganism that's there. And we can also see that when Paul writes to the different congregations and he starts talking about this idolatry, and he's not specifically talking about, come out and specifically calls whatever it may be called, but he talks about how idolatry is wrong. And so here you can find, in reference to this temple of Jupiter, there's a magnificent stairway, and it's surrounded by 54 columns. The cella, a holy of holies, 290 by 160 feet, over 5 times as large as the Parthenon in Athens. 6 of the great 100-ton Corinthian columns of the Pyrrhic style remain standing today. 65 feet high. They all are the tallest in the Greek Roman world, and atop the columns in 16-foot decorated with lions and bulls and things of that sort showing over them. So you had all this there in reference to these temples. Adjoining the temple of Jupiter on the south, though, was a temple of Bacchus with a cella about 87 by 75 feet, originally surrounded by a peristyle of 46 columns, 57 feet high. And it's just amazing. And like I said, we studied archaeology at Fayetteville, and it's just amazing how these buildings and some of them, when you look at some of the pictures, they didn't have all of the machinery that we had to build that stuff, cranes and things like that we have. But they actually leave us no better example of a Roman temple interior. So east of the Acropolis was a round temple, rare in Syria. That was probably a temple of Venus, and it was constructed around 250 AD. But the walls of the temple complex were 2 miles in circumference. Huge stones appeared in the walls. The three largest being 64 feet, 14 feet high, 11 feet thick, and each weighed something like 1,000 tons. How in the world did they move those things? The largest stone of all never made it out of the quarry and may be seen about a mile and south of the modern town. It measured. Now, here is this rock boulder. It measured 70 by 14 by 13 feet. The busy town that once surrounded the temples of Baalbek has vanished, and no temple to excavate its remains has yet been made. No attempt has. So one estimates puts the population of that city around 200,000. Now, we say all of that, and then we talk about when we think about the beginning of the Seleucid or the Syrian kingdom. We think about the Antiochus, and we read and study from the Maccabean period between the Testaments. But Antiochus the first, 280-261 BC, actually defied his father. Seleucus the Conqueror. After his death, his successors developed an official dynastic cult, which served as a kind of cement to provide a central focus for the state. And so the worship paid to king was really an expression of political loyalty rather than real religious experience. And so with this Hellenistic ruler cult as a background, then all of a sudden we find these people in the New Testament. That is, we find Augustus that easily introduced the cult, a personification of Rome, the worship of the goddess Roman, and to associate it with the worship of the Caesars. This was an important element of the religious scene during the New Testament times. But you go all the way back to the Antiochus, the first, and you find that this is where some of this comes, and it developed in what we would call Caesar worship. Now, the Baalbek temples, the great temples of Baalbek built in the 2nd and 3rd century, speak of the vitality of paganism during the centuries that Christianity was beginning to make an impact in that of Syria. They demonstrated that paganism did not roll over or play dead with Christianity invaded. They also showed the energy that pagans would exert to glorify their gods and raise the questions of whether Christians will do as much. And so eventually the temple ceased to function. And so around the 4th century, now again, you have to put stuff in history because of Catholicism. Around the 4th century, a Christian church was built in the middle of the complex. During the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian carried some materials from the Baalbek for use in his great church in Constantinople, now Istanbul, which we call Hagia Sophia. As the end of the 6th century, the ruling class of Baalbek was still a heathen. So the ruin of Baalbek temples came partly as a result of the deliberate destruction of pagan worship centers, but a series also of earthquakes. And so you had that type of religion that was taking place. And then what comes along next is this idea of the mystery religions. And while most people would still worship the old gods, a large number would turn to mystery religion during the Hellenistic age. And so the mysteries they sought was a more personal faith that would bring them into immediate contact with deity, and a faith that would offer a more emotional experience than the worship of the old gods or involvement in the newer philosophies, as they would put it. But each of the mystery religions were centered around about a god who died and was resurrected. Now, this is interesting. Each would have a ritual through which the initial participant in the experience of the god and was rendered a candidate for immortality, and each guaranteed its devotees ultimate escape from the miserable world about them in an immortal afterlife. They were called mysteries because they aimed by secret and mysterious rituals to achieve the fusion of the worship as a divine savior. So these chief mysteries holding popular sway were the Eleusinian of Greece and Cybele of Asia Minor, Isis and Osiris of Egypt. Mithraism of Persia, and Aphrodite Adonis of Syria and Asia Minor. Now, the mystery religions all had at their base a divinity whose annual death and resurrections correspond to the rhythm of the seasons. As plants die in the fall and were reborn in the spring, the vegetation spirits were thought to have gone to the underworld, to have returned from it. They raised from the dead, they could bestow immortality on mankind. So all of this is taking place, and so Christianity had some similarities to the mystery religion in that it's sometimes classified as a mystery religion, but the difference greatly exceeds the similarities. In other words, Christianity is based on a historical rather than a mythological person, on a being who died and rose and rose from that of the dead as an atonement for that of mankind, rather than repeated in some rhythm of the seasons. So normally the mystery religions did not put specific demands on an individual to live a new lifestyle, nor did they offer a supernatural enablement for living as Christianity did. So while the rites of initiation in the mystery religion were secret and were never fully revealed, even by the initiates who defected, the means of becoming a Christian has been almost literally shouted from the housetop and have been published in detail from that in the scripture. So there are differences between that of the mystery religion. Now, we do find, and we do understand in reference to that of Syria and all the things that she would have been involved in. And so as a frontier province, Syria had an important part to play in the defense of the Roman Empire. And so since we're talking about the New Testament world, Rome stationed nearly all the standing army in Syria, along in Danube, along the Rhine, and in North Africa, where within the pacified province, a few squadrons of police or local militia was maintained the order, and the emperor did not need to rely on the army elsewhere to keep himself in power. He had other props to maintain that authority. And chief rulers among them were the ruler cults, as we've already talked about, and therefore it was a growing bureaucracy. Rome had as we would say, a neat little arrangement by which the emperor could keep control of the military power of the state, and still he would ensure its essential civilian character. In other words, he allowed them to do what they would like to do among their culture and their manners and things of that sort, and have their laws and so on. Augustus divided rule in the emperor between the emperors of the Senate, and both in Rome and abroad. And we studied about the government in reference to it as a whole. So here's what they would do. He divided the province into imperial and senatorial provinces, and the senatorial needed a pacification or border defense. And so in these, Rome maintained troops, and the emperor appointed the governors. So in the senatorial provinces, the Senate empowered. In the senatorial provinces, the Senate appointed the governors and managed the province affairs. And so naturally, the military and the political situation remained somewhat fluid, and provinces might be moved from one category to another, but there was some type of rule. And so another way of gaining some support for Rome and for all what Rome stood for in the provinces was to plant colonies of veterans there. That is, Augustus made Beirut a veteran colony. Claudius and Vespasian established other Roman colonies in Syria later in the 1st century. In other words, they moved the veterans there and let the veterans live there. And so they would have some type of rule. They were loyal to that of Augustus or to who the Caesar may have been. They were loyal to Rome. And so 4 Roman legions were regularly stationed in Syria early in the 1st Christian century between it's Augusta and Caligula. About 65% of these came from Italy, but that percentage was hard to maintain. And between about 50 and the outbreak of the first Jewish revolt in 66 AD, that percentage dropped to just under 50, with the rest coming from the provinces. So the boundaries of Syria that the army had to defend were in the northwest and along the upper Euphrates River and in the south, which is now desert. But the modern observer would not conjure up a scene of trackless or uncharted desert with fluid conditions as they appear today. In Roman times, much of that land was under prosperous cultivation, as crops. And as we've noticed earlier, that there had been a climate change. Something had taken place. And so we don't need to let our climate change people know that, I guess. But we do understand that there are things that take place. And so therefore there was that took place. The area was cooler and wetter during the early Christian centuries than it is now. And so moreover, soil exhaustion and deforestation and especially the breakdown of the elaborate system of irrigation have left the arid desert today. So there were things that were being done, but all that stuff's gone today. Therefore, it doesn't hold water. There is plenty of evidence of prosperous towns along the Syrian frontier in the New Testament times. And they could not be there if they did not have the right type of areas, water and things of that sort. I've often thought to myself, and I say this kiddingly sometimes, the Ohio River and all how that flooding happens, that what they ought to do is take all of the prisoners in the United States and carry them to Arizona and let them dig all the way from Arizona to the Ohio River and have water go down into the desert in Arizona. People laugh, but there should be some type of irrigation system that they could work out to get rid of some of that flooding up in Ohio in that Mississippi River area, that they could flush water down through that of the deserts out in Arizona. But they probably messed up Arizona then, so the government would. But this is not a government class. So, sometimes the Romans, they would put soldiers in the towns in the popular areas or populated areas. They built structures for them alongside private buildings like barracks, administrative headquarters, and storage depots. And other times, the military camps gave rise to a town. Merchants and camp followers gathered around the camps. I was in Vietnam, and we would set up a base camp, and next thing you know, we'd have a village around us. People would come. We'd set up foxholes, and if it's going to be a permanent base camp or a permanent fire station, as we would call it, to where we would have artillery and everything, then all of a sudden you'd see people building little huts because they wanted to be able to service the GI with things that we couldn't get, but they could get it off the black market and so forth. So other times military camps gave rise to towns, and so the merchants just followed. And so legions gave birth to towns, and some of them never had any names but that of the legion stationed there. So it still appears the platforms of sending fire signals have been discovered in Syria and also along the roadside. So the enemy that came beyond that of the Syrian border remained to be the Parthian kingdom, as we said earlier. So twice since the Romans had taken over Syria, the Parthians, now again, just stop for a moment. When you think about that, you go back to Acts chapter 2, and I think that would be probably one of the things that we might ought to do as we go through, look at some of this, is the Parthians, there were people, that is Jewish people in Parthenia, and in Acts 2, they came to the day of Pentecost, and they most likely obeyed the gospel and went back. But just remember that if you want to, when you look at one of these areas, we look at one of them, and they start talking about these different names, that we go back and look at Acts chapter 2, see if they were there. Twice since the Romans had taken Syria, the Parthians had scored big against the Romans. There's 53 BC at the Old Testament Haran. They killed Cassius and 30,000 of his men. And during the Roman civil wars, they took advantage of the Roman weakness and occupied Syria near Palestine from 40 to 38 BC. Now, during the New Testament era, however, Rome did not have to fight a major war with the Parthians. She established the situation by depending on client kings to keep things under control. Now, again, if those client kings got out of line, then they would be replaced. But especially useful proved to be the kingdom of Armenia and the Judean kingdom of Herod the Great. And that's, when we read a lot about the Herods. And so, fortunately for Rome, when conditions deteriorated seriously, Parthia was distracted by problems on their own borders. And so Roman diplomats ventured into the east, also proved to be moderately successful. So Rome's scuffles with the Parthians did not really concern the biblical narrative. But Rome's troops in Syria did not really get involved in Palestine until the times of the First Jewish Revolt in 66 to 72, and the Roman Civil War after the death of Nero in 68. So an account of their military action is unnecessary here. Now, if you really want to know what went on during those times, you can read the book of Josephus, and especially about the wars, and he'll tell you about the wars and also about the destruction of Jerusalem and how bad that it was. And I always mention that they had sidewalks, about like the sidewalks that we have, and there's something about 1,100,000 Jews that were killed in the city. And they actually, he says that the blood came over the sidewalks when it was flowing down the street. We mentioned also about housing and the furniture, and when we look at the Roman world as a whole, when we look at Syria, the more durable houses of the wealthy had left fairly substantial remains for the excavator to investigate. And so there are similarities in style of upper class houses all over the Mediterranean world during that period, whether in Pompeii or Jerusalem or Antioch on the Orontes. Owners beautified their floors with mosaics. And even individuals of moderate means, they tried to have a little mosaic in at least one room. So the top classes might have them everywhere. During the first century, the decor might be a black and white or preferably in some color, but color productions usually had geometric designs. And so the intricate floor tapestries that appear in many of the art books dates from later centuries, at least in Syria and North Africa during Pompeii. Is an exception to that, so that the fact that the Hellenistic houses excavated near the Temple of Jerusalem had generic designs in their floors is not necessarily results of Jewish adherence to the first or second commandments. But Mediterranean and Near Eastern houses, constructions going all the way back to Abraham, featured a great open courtyard with rooms built around it. The Hellenistic and the Roman style houses also had their open courtyards, but surrounded them with stone pillars. And so then you'd have the well-to-do Antioch. In Antioch, in the early Christian centuries, they built rectangular houses with a colonnade on the entrance side. Though through that colonnade, one entered a large dining room with floor mosaics, of course, surrounded by rooms on the other three sides, also with mosaic rooms or floors. And so another increasingly common feature of the house of the wealthy during the first century and following the spaciousness, people seemingly spent more time indoors and entertained friends or business or government associates more often. So they especially had a ever large household staffs and usually composed of slaves. But in Apamea and also on the Orontes south of Antioch, a city of 400,000 or more, with an aristocracy of rich landowners, and houses might be as large as 5,000 or 15,000 square feet houses. And that would be a lot of cleaning, so you'd have to have somebody there helping you do that. People on the lower on the part of the economic and social scale still frequently lived in houses of several rooms arranged around an open central court. If they could not afford that, they might live in a rectangular house or 3 or 4 rooms or even in a single room. Now, the poorest, as in earlier periods, might still sleep on the floor or have bedrolls or sit on the floor around a mat or a cloth to eat, but all classes tried to have some furniture. So according to their means, householders had 3 or 4-legged stools, chairs with backs and arms, and beds with mattresses supported on a wooden frame with slats or ropes, or wood or reed clothes, stored boxes, or low wooden tables for dining, because they sat on the floor, or even couches on which to recline while eating. An alternative, and we saw that when we studied in reference to the birth of Christ and so on, and also about the Last Supper. A brick bench with a cushion could also serve as a sofa. Most affluent might have wood furniture with inlay or tables or chairs, largely of bronze or iron. And so, it just be according to where you were in reference to your economy, economical, or your wealth or no wealth. There was also an abundance and variety of different foods. Again, now remember, like we said, that they had fertile land, so they had a method of production of agriculture in the first century during the Christian time. The Roman peace and scientific methods of the Hellenistic agriculture especially contributed to the increase of production. And so you had the stable political conditions that they had, and you had the protection of the production, and the arteries of supply are essential prosperous agriculture. So they had all of that, as we've already seen. And so advances in techniques are necessary. And so if improvement is to be to do more, merely enhance the status quo. So as a result, the Hellenistic studies of agriculture, rotation of crops, and the practice of leaving some land fallow became more common. And we have to remember that under the Mosaic law, that there were things that there were laws given by God in reference to the land had to rest and things of that sort. So there were improvements included in fertilization and the production of quality seeds, and as well as attention to irrigation where that was practical. And you remember again, you had the water that was there, and as I said before the climate change. Now, the thing is that when you look at what went on there in reference to the crops, they had wheat, they had oats, they had barley, they had rye, and that was constituted the principal nourishment of all the classes. Now, some have indicated that sometimes, like we mentioned corn, that it's not the kind of corn we had, it's something else. But rice, which requires irrigation, grew along the coast. And so popular vegetables like lentils, beans, kidney beans, chickpeas, cabbage, and radishes, they had those types of things. So basically everything you would need in the garden. Antioch, now get this, Antioch, where Paul was, it was famous for its cucumbers. So that's where kosher comes from. I just kidding. The poor especially relish onions and leeks and garlic, with the garlic, the Heliopolis, valued very high. Spices produced in Syria included coriander, mustard, let me get this, anise, cumin, ginger, and mint. Only the rich ate meat regularly. They enjoyed fowl, fish, beef, ham, mutton, seemingly consuming fairly large quantities by the 2nd century when prosperity actually reached its peak. So, and also among all of that, they had fruit-bearing trees like olives, dates, and figs, and pistachios were especially important. The Nicolean dates of the Damascus were large and as sweet as honey. So the Damascus plum was also much enjoyed. So they had just about it. I hadn't seen no oranges and apples yet. But the idea is the culture of the vine was generally conducted on large estates. Syrian wine people, not winers, were popular throughout the ancient world. Antioch, Byblos, Tripoli, Bertus, and Tyre were among the wine-producing centers of the world. The wines of the Antioch area were especially prized. So I wonder what would happen if they were to find a bottle of wine over there when they were digging. Be worth some money, I bet. Of course, agriculture involves more than the production of that of the food stuff. Syrian farmers also raised quantities of papyrus, flax, and hemp. I wonder they didn't know how important hemp was. Well, they may have. And cotton. Papyrus especially provided writing material, but also rope and baskets, and mats, and more. And flax furnished linens for clothing. Hemp supplied rope and strong fabric. And, of course, cotton provided clothing. So not much new there. But they did not have the machinery that we had to make the things that we made. Then their dress, we've mentioned some about that. And I really think sometimes that maybe some of the women who teach women's class on ladies' days or teach their ladies' classes, that some of them might ought to get together to maybe study the dress of the first century people. I think that would be a good study for them to do, and not picking on them, because men also need to know about dress. But as we think about those early people living in the beginning of the church in Antioch, we wonder how they dressed. Much of what was said in our last lesson applied to contemporary Syria, but some additional comments may be helpful. Fabrics might be made of wool, linen, or cotton. And so probably most of it was made of wool because it's more readily available and probably cheaper. because they had more of it. And also the mountainous and hilly areas of Syria called for clothing providing greater warmth than in Palestine, farther south. So how much fabric was made of cotton this early in history, we cannot say, though we know that the farmers over the border of Syria produced it all the way back to 700 BC. But secondly, the price of dyeing depended on the color and the dye used. So the poorest tend to wear white clothing. But all classes like to have some color in their wardrobe, so there were several dye stuffs, as they were called, were available. One called woad, W-O-A-D, that was producing a blue color. Saffron, orange yellow, henna, reddish brown, and madder, moderate to strong red, and murex shales rose to dark violet, to name most of the important. Those are the important. Most of the production of dyes occurred in the vicinity to the textile manufacturing district of Tyre, but there were also other places, and so they would be able to dye their stuff. Probably all they had to do is to make a white T-shirt for their little boys and girls, and they'll go out and play. They could dye them for them. The Syrians had a substantial number of mosaics from houses of the Antioch that we talked about, and also that portrayed both men and women. Admittedly, they date after the New Testament period, but they confirm that we know and surmise from other information that we have to be careful in our use of these mosaics, however, because they usually feature the upper class and probably people living in that towns. Women have hair of shoulder length or shorter, or have it dressed and piled on top of their head in a pile. Now, most men standardly wore short hair and rather had beards. Poorer people in towns and in the rural areas may not have had sufficient access to barbers. So while sandals were still the footwear of choice, many men are shown wearing boots laced up to the calf. This may be due to the kind of activity in which they were engaged, if they were hunting boots or things of that sort, or some type of terrain problem where they worked in the Syrian mountains. They would have to have something else. As clothing style, now, this is where I was thinking about in reference to, trying to describe the clothing for that of especially women and men. The clothing style, the tunic was still the basic garment. And that was made by taking two pieces of cloth and sewing them together, leaving the hole for the head and the neck. Belted is usually, had sleeves, belted, and then it usually had sleeves to the elbow or wrist, but some were sleeveless. So upper class men usually wore a robe over the tunic. Extending to the ankles, but lower class men engaged in some kind of activity were ready for action where only a tunic extended to that of the knee. In other words, most of them, as we covered before in studying Mr. Bell's book, that most of the men would wear them that way because in case there was an attack or something of them, they were able to fight. So this is constant with what we know of the Roman society that we studied. Upper class men were not supposed to engage physical labor. Nearly all the Mosaic representatives we have date after 212 were all free men in the empire of the Roman citizenship. So lower class men were frequently slaves, therefore not portrayed as gentlemen. So in all of the pictures of women are shown with long robes over their tunics extended to the floor, and some of these seem to be held together at the shoulders by pins and brooches and things of that sort. But sometimes women also would wear a shawl over that of their hair. In other words, they would put a covering. And that would be something that, according to, like the Corinthians would do. If we were to study the Corinthians, we would come up with a number of customs for them. Now, let me see right quick. I'm going to drop down and deal with something else before, and then we will deal with family life next week because it's 10:21. But, we look at all of that, and we're going to talk about the family. And hold on, let me go back and highlight that family. Don't I forget to go back right there. We'll highlight that in yellow. So I know to go back there in blue. I guess we won't highlight it at all. Okay, we'll just highlight it like that. But, we have all of this and we find it to do, but what did they do for a good time? Entertainment. Well, among the pagans, and I think maybe this is where when we begin to read 1 Corinthians 6 and Galatians 5 about the fruits of the flesh or the works of the flesh, things they were involved in, that was some of this. And entertainment abounded in pagan and secular Syria in the first century. They had the theater, Antioch did. They had the amphitheater, the hippodrome, the stadiums, and the baths. Now remember the baths, they didn't wear clothing. So did Laodicea, Bertis, Tyre, and other cities. They had horse racing. They had musical and dancing displays, theatric plays, arena shows of gladiators and wild beast hunts, especially put on by convicts and prisoners of war, abounded. And a large number of Jews taken prisoner at the fall of Jerusalem were condemned to put on the gladiator combats and wear beast hunts and fighting to the death in the arenas of Syria. So the wealthy of Syria especially enjoyed the hunting and the fowling. So you see they had something for everybody in reference to that of what we would call entertainment. Whether we would agree with the entertainment, they did have some way to entertain people, and people actually were drawn to whatever they enjoyed doing. And so basically the same thing with us today. Any questions or thoughts? I know I did all the talking, y'all. Y'all didn't talk. I'll talk in my sleep. I better save all of that. Okay. Y'all have a good week. And we'll finish this. I'm trying to remember I think Ephesus is the next city. And if it is, again, it would be to dealing with some of the things that they did. I'm going to look and see. I'm probably going to try to make the last city that we look at Corinth. To me, Corinth they were like Ephesus. They had a lot of manners and especially customs. And so if I find the material on that, hopefully we're going to change back. We're not going to have 18 weeks. We're going to have 15 weeks of 2.5 hours. And Bobby won't be going to long periods. Bobby's coming just to Marietta. Well, I'm going to Panama.
Thank you. I'm taking you with me, Bobby.
Oh, by the way, a while ago when you was chewing those potato chips.
I was hungry, Bobby.
I know, but you didn't cut off the thing. They were hearing you chop away.
Oh, I thought I was muted. I'm sorry.
I didn't hear you. They heard you.
And then he was playing with a squeaky toy when he or something.
Sorry about that. I won't eat next week.
Yeah.
No, you need to eat.
You need to eat. I eat before I get here so I don't get hungry. Every once in a while I get hungry. So, all right. Y'all have a good night. Appreciate it.
Be good, Bobby.
Yes, sir.
It's not raining here yet.
Is it raining over there with y'all, Rita?
No, I got a severe thunderstorm warning pop up on my phone for 3 a.m. here. So
3 a.m.? Well, I'll be
that's what
asleep
it
by
looks
then.
like now.